If you've ever seen a map like this before, you'll have seen biomes. Biomes are regions of the planet Earth broken down by the different types of vegetation and the climate that exist in these regions. What we're going to do in this video is just take a quick fly through of the key biomes that exist in the planet. Now, you can break biomes down further. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it just gives you an example of some of the biomes that we can find around the planet. And we're going to start off close to home here in the UK. In the UK, we find what's known as temperate woodland. And this is where we find mainly deciduous broadleaf trees. And these are kind of green in the summer, and they shed their leaves in the cooler months towards the winter. And you can see this in the images on the left hand side. Rainfall is generally quite high, somewhere between 500 to 1500 millimeters a year, and this is generally spread out through the year. Temperatures in winter generally on average above 0 degrees Celsius, so frost happens, but it's not a constant feature of this particular biome. And summer temperatures can average somewhere between 20 to 25 degrees Celsius. Much of the UK and Europe will have been a temperate woodland, and it still is a predominant habitat within these regions. Obviously, a lot of it's been cut down through human development, but this is where we find these particular biomes. Now, next up, we're going to move across to North America, to the tundra. And the tundra essentially is a biome that means treeless plain. We don't tend to find trees in the tundra, and it's mainly to do with the climate. Tree growth is hindered by low temperatures and short growing seasons. So, because of the position on the Earth's surface, this particular region doesn't tend to get much sunlight. And when it does get sunlight, it's not generally for long enough for trees to get the energy they require to grow. Low temperatures, very, very little precipitation, a little bit of snow, and poor nutrients in the soils mean that this isn't a good place for trees to grow. What we do find instead is small shrubs and lichens that tend to dominate the land. And you can see this in the images again on the left, kind of small trees, shrubs, maybe heather, things like that. And we tend to find tundra only in two places: in the Arctic Circle in the northern hemisphere, around Canada. And we also find tundra in alpine regions. This is what we mean by alpine, is up at the top of mountains, towards the top of mountains, where you go beyond what's known as the tree line. The altitude means that it's much colder, there's less oxygen available to the things that live there, and we find tundra in these regions as well. You may also find tundra in regions where glaciers have retreated. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in the video. Now, the next stop is just a bit further south into Canada, and we're going to go into what we call taiga or boreal forest. This is generally a biome that we only find in the northern hemisphere, and it is predominantly covered in coniferous trees. These are evergreen trees, things like pines, spruces, and larches. We find them in Alaska, Canada, Scandinavia, and Siberia. Again, as we said, in the northern hemisphere. The yearly precipitation here is generally quite high, but a lot of it will be snow rather than rain itself. We get about 250 to 750 millimeters a year precipitation. So there's a little bit more there for the trees. The trees tend to be they grow quite slowly, and they use their resources quite slowly in the same sense. We get long, cold winters here and short, mild, wet summers. And it's those short, mild, wet summers that the trees use to grow. Next up, we're going to go further south over to Asia. Okay, and here we find the grassland. Grasslands, these are large rolling terrains of grasses, flowers, and herbs. And again, what we tend to find here is we don't tend to find trees. When we think about why that is, now the rainfall is high here. It's high enough for grasses. It's generally not high enough for trees. What we tend to find in these particular regions is we do get regular droughts and fires. And the fires prevent the growth of large shrubs and trees. And it means that these habitats and these biomes are predominantly covered in grasses. Thin soils, because of the fact we don't have those trees, the soils tend to be a product of tree leaves being broken down by microorganisms, and we don't get that kind of breakdown and that recycling in these particular regions. So the soils don't tend to be suitable for tree formation. And we find them in three places. And you might not necessarily be familiar with grasslands in this particular form, but we find them in the steppes, and this is in Asia, so around Mongolia. In South America, they're known as the pampas. And in the USA, where you probably will have heard of them, they're known as the prairies. It's where we find bison and things like that. And they tend to be kind of landlocked biomes. They don't tend to be near the coast. And because of that, they're quite dry. And that's why we don't tend to find that tree growth. It's not suitable for that. Okay. Next up, we're going to jump into Africa. And we're going to go to the savanna. Now, the savanna is quite similar to a grassland, but what we do find in the savanna is trees. And these trees form essentially a mixed woodland grassland ecosystem. The trees generally are widely spaced, and this means that there isn't a canopy, and it means that sunlight can reach the ground, and it gives the grass and the other shrubs the ability to grow quite well. Now, these regions are generally hot. They're quite close to the equator. The temperatures generally not so fluctuate. They're seasonally dry, and we get wet seasons in the summer. And these wet seasons are extremely wet, and you'll get flooding. You'll get really vast amounts of water that will hit these regions, and the plants will grow and flourish in those times. The Serengeti in Tanzania is probably the most famous, and you might have seen these particular habitats and biomes, things like the Lion King. Next up is the rainforest. The rainforests are hot, moist climates that are found around the equator. So they actually generally sit on the actual equator. They receive the most rainfall of any biome. They can upwards of 2,000 to 10,000 millimeters of precipitation every year, and it rains very, very constantly, on and off. And this is where they get the name rainforest from. Temperatures are pretty constant. They're generally always over about 20 degrees Celsius, but it doesn't go too high. It goes up to about 25 degrees Celsius. And this gives perfect conditions for vines, palms, orchids, and ferns to grow. Now, the ferns tend to be plants that grow on the base of the rainforest. The base of the rainforest doesn't tend to get a lot of sunlight, and because of this, the ferns grow very well, and you can see that in some of the images there on the left-hand side. Now, rainforests have the most biodiversity of any land biome, so this is where we find the biggest array of living creatures anywhere on the planet. And we're still finding species every day in the rainforest. Now, the majority of rainforest is located in Brazil, but we also find them in West Africa and also in Southeast Asia around Indonesia, Borneo, Papua New Guinea, and then places like that. They are under quite a lot of threat, but they are kind of really important biomes. Now, the last biome we're going to have a quick look at is the desert, and it's really quite important to look at the desert. People often think that deserts don't have any plants, but they do, because obviously we may forget about cacti and other succulents like that. Now, deserts are extremely fluctuant in terms of their temperature. During the day, they have about 38 degrees average temperature, and at night, they don't hold on to that temperature very well, and it can drop as low as -4 degrees at night, and that makes it very difficult for plant life and any kind of animal life to kind of live in these conditions. Some obviously has. We'll talk about that. They're the driest of all biomes, so we do get rain in the deserts. Possibly as much as 250 millimeters of rain per year. But this tends to be in very, very short seasons, short wet seasons, when some plants will flourish in those times. And we tend to get cacti, small bushes, very short grasses that will all have adapted for life in the desert. They may adapt by growing very slowly and using very little water, like a cacti. Others may be known as what we call perennials. They will only grow when there is water available, and they will lie dormant in the soil or in the sand until water is available. Examples include the Sahara in North Africa, the Gobi Desert in East Asia, and the Atacama Desert in South America. Okay, so just to summarize, biomes are large ecological units composed of similar communities on a global scale. Generally speaking, biomes arise as a result of complex interactions of climate and physical biotic factors. Okay, so all of those three things come together to decide essentially what biome exists in a given region. Temperature and precipitation are really important in terms of plant life. So plants require heat, not too much, and they require water to photosynthesize. And it's the plants that sit at the base of every food web, which we're going to talk about later in this unit. Plants determine what lives where. Changes in climate can cause biomes to change over time, so a biome is definitely not set in place. If climate changes, the biome can change too. Now, all we need to do is consider 10,000 years ago, Europe will have just come out of a glacial period, what we'd known as the Ice Age, and it would have been much, much cooler, much colder, less precipitation, and it will have been probably a tundra. Much of Europe will have been a tundra, and as the temperature increased and the precipitation slightly increased, we would have seen the emergence of the deciduous woodlands and temperate woodlands that we saw before the humans started to colonize this particular region. And at the same time, North Africa, much of North Africa, will have been covered in rich grassland. A lot of fresh water will have been available there. And what we've seen there is the emergence of deserts, and the desert is growing all the time. And that is because of a lack of precipitation in that particular region and an increase in the average annual temperature. Hopefully you've made some notes from this. You can pause the video at any stage and go back through it. And then you can now move on to the quiz on biomes.